Welcome to Transformation Talks, your guide to navigating complex change. Each episode brings you expert insights, practical strategies, and real-world stories on delivering impactful transformation. From managing technology rollouts to driving cultural shifts, we'll help you tackle the challenges of change and build lasting success. I'm Hayley Saich, Head of Marketing for one of the UK's leading management consultancies, and for the next 30 minutes, your podcast host. In today's episode, we welcome two transformers, Emma Anderson, a change management expert, and Giles Randle, a digital guru. If you're a change leader ready to master the art of transformation, this podcast is for you. Emma, Giles, welcome to the Project One podcast and the very first podcast. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Hayley. Excited to be here.
Lovely to be here.
So for those who don't know you, you are labelled as Transformers. You've been on the side of a bus. I've seen you in a tube station on a giant poster. So tell me, from your perspective, what is a professional transformer?
Oh, crikey. Yes, I had a right Carrie Bradshaw moment when I was on the side of a bus and saw it in London. So thanks for that reminder, Hayley. So what is a professional transformer? So to me, being a transformer is all about driving change, being part of the team, rolling up our sleeves and working with our customers to really make sure we live and breathe what they're trying to do every day, and make sure that we, like I say, don't just deliver, but we go above and beyond that, and we leave a lasting legacy of change so that we can look back and say we have fully transformed whatever it was that we were set out to do.
A lasting legacy of change. I like it. So Giles, how about you?
There are two different perspectives that I've observed in our industry. There's people that think they're in transformation to manage programs, which is the mechanics of delivery. And at the other end of the spectrum, there are people that are here to make things different, make things better. And as a transformer, I think we live on the extreme of the extreme in delivering sustainable, long-term change within an organization. The mechanics, the program management, the slideware, all of the rest of it, that's all great stuff. It has to be done. But our perspective, our values speak to leaving enterprises better than when we arrived. And I think that's what gets us out of bed in the morning. And that is the transformer mindset versus the program manager mindset.
I couldn't agree more about going above and beyond, making the difference, being open, building effective relationships. You can't transform a business without doing all of that. I think more important than ever is making sure that the change doesn't just get delivered, but it actually gets adopted and sustained, and a real focus on change management and leaders being equipped and capable in terms of actually landing that change in the business so that the changes stick and the benefits are realised is more important than it's ever been. That heightened awareness around the people-centric part of change is really coming to the fore. There's been more and more talk around how important it is to focus on change management. And we know that research tells us programs are 6 times more likely to fail if they don't invest in change management. So it's a huge opportunity at the moment. It's really exciting for us as transformers to be a part of this and be able to help businesses shape and deliver their future.
So clearly people are at the centre of any change programme. But Giles, where do leaders really need to start when facing a big, complex change and transformation in their business?
So getting the basics right, I think, has never been more important. Setting up your portfolio management, understanding how you get programs from an idea right the way through to successful delivery, exactly as you were saying, Emma, in terms of the business change, the people change, creating the value in the business. So this is such a fundamental question, I think, right now. There's obviously a lot here. There's a huge literature on how you land transformation effectively, but to distill it down, I think there are 4 key areas that I would focus on think phase 1 is around how do we business case, how do we prioritize our backlog. Phase 2 is around how are we going to plan, how are we going to roadmap, particularly where you've got so many different transformation programs running in parallel. How are you going to air traffic control them? How are you going to ensure we don't try and deploy too much change simultaneously into the business? Phase 3 is around delivering and governing. So what is your operating model around governing at a project level, at a program level, and then at a portfolio level? And how do we ensure successful delivery? And then the final thing, I think so often this is overlooked, particularly from digital transformation specialists. And it's the landing the change, assuring the change. It's the people-centered perspective that really is what unlocks a lot of this. Right? So you can deploy the system transformation so effectively, you can make all the right decisions in terms of product choice and systems integrator choice, and your program can be perfectly executed. But if the people don't really buy into it, if their behavior, their perspective doesn't change to reflect the assumptions that you've made within your business case, then the business value just won't be there for you.
That's really helpful to hear the different phases involved in a transformation program. Emma, what's your view from a change management perspective?
We all know that change is about people, and you've mentioned people there a few times, Giles, but people don't just go from A to B overnight. It takes time. And I think the more you can iterate that transition journey for colleagues, the far easier it will be to take people on that journey. And it's much easier to sell a smaller, more meaningful change than perhaps the massive blue sky thinking, where people just look at that and think, wow, that's so alien to me right now. I need to be taken back to how do I take baby steps to get to where the business wants to get to. I really love that idea, Giles, of focusing on those small steps. I think just picking up on your point around planning, again, from a change management perspective, it's so important not to get seduced by the temptation to jump straight in and want to do everything. And I think the best thing leaders can do is pause and just really assess, have their teams and have their leaders got the capability and the capacity to focus on all of the changes that you're potentially talking about, not just landing at once, but delivering. Like, you and I know how tiring and challenging it can be working on these programs. Sometimes when we start out with business cases, we forget about the journey it takes to actually get to where we want to go. And that takes energy in itself. The other big thing to be considering, like I say, there's change fatigue and the energy that's needed involved in change, but also really thinking about the impact on people.
That's so important. And having that lens on what's going to land, what level of risk are we running, how much change, how much oxygen is there in the room for the kind of change we're looking to. So often these big organizations lose out on that lens right up front. It becomes purely a financial conversation around what's the return on investment, how are we going to make sure we're spending our budget wisely, etc. And of course, those dynamics are incredibly important, but there's a bit of a reality check that sometimes gets missed in this initial phase, and you end up prioritizing the biggest programs, and you're trying to deploy 4, 5, 6 different mega transformations simultaneously because they had the biggest ROI. And the reality is you often end up failing because you're trying to do too much at once. You just don't have that conveyor belt of transformation and change that you can land successfully.
So can I ask, how do you remedy that?
When you lay it out, is anyone going to step back and look at the quantum of change that you're trying to achieve, and with an experienced eye, someone has actually done this scale of change before and understands what it truly takes to land them successfully? Is anyone looking at it and saying, yeah, that looks about right, given the people we've got, the talent we've got, the relationships with partners that we've got? Or are you just drifting into something that actually, retrospectively, will say, well, that wasn't really achievable? And so often it's not achievable because the change management aspects are overlooked. The people is where it really resides.
Yeah, 100%, Giles. Taking that step back to think about the impact on people and what we're asking of those individuals, not just in terms of the ultimate goal, but the actual delivery and the ride of the programme as well.
And Giles, that feeds into the third phase that you talked about at the beginning around delivering and governing any change and transformation effectively. And it's so often framed, isn't it, in terms of the methodology debate.
Exactly. Are we going to do waterfall? Are we going to do agile? Are we going to do wagile? Are we going to do safe, scrum? How are we going to deliver this? And that stuff's all important. That fundamental good practice is good practice. It doesn't matter what methodology you're using. Getting the basics right is so important. And that really, to my mind, from a delivery and governance perspective, looks like transparency. Can you actually get a realistic, accurate picture of where you are at any given point in time? We talk a lot about the watermelon programs.
Oh, hold on. Watermelon. Can you elaborate for our listeners?
Everything's green and inside it's red.
Oh, yes, of course. So if it's a green program, it's on track. But if it's a red program, it's in trouble.
Exactly. And it's maybe a bit of a cliche, but there is obviously truth in that analogy. And how many times have we joined an organization to find exactly this? So many programs, the dashboard is green, there's maybe a couple of ambers. And after 2 or 3 days in the program, you've maybe spoken to half a dozen people, and it's really obvious the program is nothing like that. It's not in that place at all.
It not be less than
Exactly. And you wonder, how on earth could this have happened? And so often it comes down to 3 really simple but really difficult to fix things. The first thing is the person doing the update either doesn't think it's their job to understand the detail and what's actually going on, or doesn't have the ability to understand what's really going on. Now, obviously, not everyone can be a specialist in all of the different nuances of transformation, but if you've got a program manager or a program director that is sat on top of a program who is keeping themselves at arm's length, that isn't interested or able to get into a level of detail, then you're going to end up with this watermelon problem, because the person that's doing the status updates, the person that's accountable, or their team immediately around them, isn't interested in figuring out what's actually going on the ground. They're just interested in making sure that everything looks right. So that's so often something we see. The second dynamic that comes through is it can be genuinely difficult to understand the status of these programs if you haven't done it a lot. Everything can look green because project plans, you can be on track, you can maybe be ahead, but unless you've actually lived through these programs multiple times, you don't know what questions to ask to get to the real heart of the matter. It's an ability to ask the right questions.
And if I can just jump in on that point, Giles, because the change manager inside me is getting irate and thinking about some of my experiences, but you're absolutely right. And I think there's a tendency in that watermelon approach, or wanting to make everything look green, is it's often focused just on the delivery of the program, and people don't actually reflect the status of the change readiness and where people are on their change journey. And that's so important, and it can be overlooked. I'm sure you've seen it so many times because we get so sucked into focusing on the program delivery that actually we should have 2 statuses running at one time, overall program, but where are our people on that journey? Because if the people aren't on the journey with us, you can have the best program plan in the world and it will mean absolutely nothing.
It's what will fundamentally be different as a result of this change when we've done it versus what's there today. And 9 times out of 10, that'll be people doing something differently, behaving differently, serving customers differently, using different insight to make better decisions. And there's a trend at the moment, I think, in the market, which I'm not entirely comfortable with, which is this idea of a value creation office or a benefits realization office, or a work stream that looks at benefits management that sits outside of the delivery core of programs and isn't a core part of the delivery and the governance itself. And the reason why I think this has a lot of risk associated with it is that it almost encourages the transformers themselves to think of benefits and fundamental real change as someone else's responsibility rather than what are we actually trying to do.
I would agree with you, Giles. That sounds like a particularly risky approach, because so much of the change management focus needs to be on that lasting legacy and how the business has changed fundamentally for the future once the program team leave. Separating out benefits realization or ownership of benefits into something which isn't defined as a really well thought through support model is a real concern. Just touching on a couple of the elements there that you've mentioned around people wanting to focus on being green, and that's almost like a PR thing, isn't it? So outwardly the program looks really rosy. I would say they're the most worrying programs, and they're the programs where I would see that the leadership team perhaps needs some support with their capability, because as a sponsor, the sponsor really should be getting under the skin of all of the statuses and fully understanding where we are.
So the sponsor is responsible for the success of the program, essentially.
In essence, they're the face of the program. So they're the one person that's going to be out in the business, seen as responsible and accountable for this change. If there is someone who's perhaps inclined to report green, the sponsor knows that it's their role to absolutely make sure that they are on the hook for delivering this.
I think that's so true. Whenever I start on a program that's been in train for a while and I see everything called green, you immediately become suspicious, because the level of complexity associated with these programs is such that the chances of everything being on track and progressing exactly as we expected is so remote, given the level of ambiguity that there inevitably is when you first start, and the level of volatility that there is associated with dependencies not being realized, changes that maybe weren't anticipated. So getting that culture right around focusing on the outcomes, your North Star being the change management aspects of people doing things differently, and creating that real focus on transparency and accuracy, I think is so important.
Yeah. And the final phase that we talked about at the very start was around landing and assuring any change, and how fundamental it is, but can often be overlooked. But people are really at the centre of that, aren't they?
This, I think, is an area where enterprises need the most help, because often they set themselves up as, well, here's a set of programs and they're going to do A, B, and C over this period of time, and then the people will be stood down, the programs will be ended, and they'll move on to something else, as opposed to thinking about what are the outcomes we're looking to achieve, and then architecting everything around those outcomes. And a lot of this comes down to the change management aspects and the people related side of things.
That point around, landing, it's so important to work with the business that are impacted to define. An example here might be user adoption metrics. So if you're landing a piece of technology, it's not just about the technology going live, but then how are people actually, A, using the new technology, B, thinking about continuous improvement even before you've gone live, because they're that excited about using the new system that they can't wait to start thinking about further improvements and further enhancements that they can be involved in. And that piece around that ownership, and we talked about the business as usual support model, if you involve people through the whole journey, they can clearly see that they will have a defined role to be part of something at the end of it as well. Keeping the same people with you on that journey as you go through the program is, again, a fundamental way of making sure that at the end you've got that ready packaged support model good to go. So
if you draw all those threads together, you and I know we've worked across multiple different industries, but whether it's about people serving customers differently in call centers, helping passengers when their flight's been delayed or cancelled, colleagues in banks helping customers in branch, field engineers ringing up a support desk for help with particularly complicated engineering problems, very different business scenarios, but actually the threads that we've talked about, it cuts across banking, public sector, utilities, retail, very, very different fundamentals. But actually, from a transformation point of view, this absolute focus on outcomes, this absolute obsession with ensuring your program is completely transparent, ensuring that everybody is focused on the value that they are creating for the customers, for colleagues in the enterprise, focused on long-term sustainable transformation and change, it seems to be universal.
Yeah, I'd agree, Giles.
It's absolutely fascinating listening to all of this. And clearly people are absolutely centre to delivering successful change and transformation. Emma, I know that you've got almost 20 years of experience that lies within change management, which is all around people-centred change. So What would you say organisations can do to start to prepare and lay these foundations for all of this upcoming change?
So a great question, Hayley. Laying the foundations, in essence, is really all about how do you prepare the business to be ready, not just to accept the change, but to be involved in the change. That point we were talking about earlier about get your people involved from day one, at the point when you are even just thinking about the idea, and get their feedback and get them excited right from the get-go so that they can be involved all through the process. If I can break it down into 3 key parts, the first one is being really clear on where we're trying to get to. So what's the ultimate vision? What's the end goal? Outcomes is the absolute key word to focus on here. It's what is going to tangibly feel and look different at the end of this change. And being able to articulate that vision in a really compelling manner, but in a way that makes sense to people. And if that vision isn't understandable and digestible, you're going to really struggle to take people on the journey with you. So my advice around articulating the vision is spend the time at the beginning really mapping out what's the story of the change that you want to tell your people. I'd say the second key area to focus on in Lay the Foundations is equipping your change leadership team. So whether that's the sponsor, so making sure that that sponsor is really clear on what that role means. This is really important around communication, because if your sponsor can't clearly communicate the change, then there's something wrong and you would need to address that. Taking the time to make sure the leadership team are really knowledgeable about the programme and the change. So what is it that is actually being delivered? And if anyone stopped them in the corridor and asked them a question, any one of the leadership team can stop and take that time. And giving people time goes such a long way on change programmes. The last thing around change leadership, I'll say, and this ties in with the employees again, is just the leadership team need to feel really comfortable and confident digging into resistance. Coming back to the watermelon programme, sometimes there's a perception that resistance isn't good, and that digging into it is going to uncover problems, which some people might think, I don't need all these extra things to deal with, but that's the worst possible thing you can do. So really make sure that you are listening and encouraging that feedback. And whether that's through resistance, you can only turn that into a constructive positive. And then the third and final point around laying the foundation. So taking the time to really diagnose your change management plan. And it's not about just looking at getting from A to B in terms of perhaps the new technology. It's about getting from A to B in terms of that behavioural change journey. And that's a very different plan. And it is never going to be a plan that ever goes to plan, because let's face it, people are people and they behave differently and they're not predictable. And that's where I think in a change management plan, it needs to look like a wiggly line, and you need to be prepared as a change manager that you might need to go back a step before you can move forward a step. Because if you haven't done something early on and really ticked a box and getting people on that journey, it will only come back to bite you later on through the plan. The other thing is really making sure you're engaging your stakeholders through that process. So what you might think as a change manager would work brilliantly, and you've got all these great ideas about setting up change networks and change champions and model offices. Actually, if you've not engaged the right stakeholders and brought them on that journey with you, again, people just won't listen to you and they won't take your advice seriously. So spending that time to really diagnose what does that change management plan look like really prevents, frankly, a haphazard approach to delivering the change.
There has been some absolutely amazing advice today. So I'd also like to leave the listeners with some more advice that perhaps they wouldn't find anywhere else. So who better to ask than our transformers here today? So for both of you, if you were to look back to the start of your career 20 years ago, if you knew then what you know now, what would you do differently?
Crikey, what a question. 20 years is a long time. If there are a couple of things I was to call out, I think for me, and this ties back, Giles, with the watermelon. So I have to be honest, perhaps in the early days of my career, I may have been prone to a bit of a watermelon programme, because I thought, in my early years, not having that experience, I thought being green was what we strive to do. And as a programme manager or a change manager, that was what we were measured on. And if it was red, or you didn't want to be red, you had too much heat on you. But actually, going through experiences like that, and I had an example when I worked in retail of a program where I really was doing the watermelon approach. It helps you understand the sorts of questions you should be asking. And as you build up your experience, you know when something isn't right. You naturally feel it in your gut. And for me, on this particular example, if I had known then what I know now, I absolutely would not have ended up in the situation I did with my program, which I had to recover at the time. But for me, it's about trusting that experience and that gut instinct to just ask the question, dig into it, challenge people, make sure that if you're given an explanation, is it actually an explanation? Do you really understand it? Does it really make sense? Because at the end of the day, you're the person that's in charge of this. And if you don't feel comfortable or get it, no one else will. And they would lose confidence in you if you didn't actually give them a proper articulate answer.
And what about you, Giles? What's your advice?
Yeah, say I can think of the day when this advice would have helped me. It was about 6 months into my career, and I was in one of these big consulting pyramids. If I could sit myself down, I think I would say 2 things. It's way more complicated than you imagine it is. And the second thing I would say to myself is the detail is really the thing that matters, because everything above the level of detail is abstraction. And abstraction is important for communication. Clearly, you can't communicate effectively if you need 1,000 points of detail to be able to explain. But abstraction is risky because detail is really where the truth and the reality resides on these mega transformation programs. But the kind of change that you and I deliver, these enterprise level, multi-year transformation programs that touch most aspects of IT, operations, customer, product, abstraction so that you can communicate is a risky process. And that, to me, is where we end up with this misalignment between senior leader perception of the health of a program and the underlying reality. And to me, I think if I had half an hour with myself 6 months into my career, complexity and detail is probably what I wish I knew then that I know now.
I think they're both brilliant ones. And I think that abstraction piece, that really ties back to what we were saying earlier, Giles, about the leadership team feeling really comfortable to dig into resistance.
And I just love to see the passion that you both clearly have for helping our customers to achieve successful change and transformation. So thank you so much for sharing your experience, sharing your advice and your knowledge. And I'm sure if anyone has any questions after listening to the podcast today, then please do just get in touch with us and Emma and Giles. I'm sure you'll be happy to answer any further questions.
Very happy, yes.
Thanks so much, Hayley.
Thank you, Hayley.
Thank you. Thanks for tuning in to Transformation Talks. We hope you found today's insights valuable in your journey to lead successful transformation. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with your network. Stay connected with us for more expert insights and stories on delivering complex change and transformation in any organisation. Join us next time to learn about PMO. It's more than just admin, you know.